Margaret, I'm speaking to amendment number 19 from People Before Profit. And just to, I suppose it's just worth starting, what are we amending? And we are amending the government's lack of a definition of just transition, and the one mention in the entire bill that the issue gets, and yet it's one of the fundamental issues that need to be dealt with. And I quote, "The requirement for just transition to a climate-neutral economy which endeavours, insofar as is practicable, to maximise employment opportunities and support persons and communities that may be negatively affected by this transition." There's nothing here at all to force a just transition, nothing here that will legally make this bill something to celebrate tonight, which I'm sure the Minister and his party will do because they see this as world historic. I'm afraid it's a missed opportunity. And I think if you were to talk to Bord na Móna workers or the aviation workers who have been laid off and in future will be laid off as we try to curtail our aviation activity, you will not find them jumping with joy and glee over this bill, because just transition for them doesn't mean that they move to equitable, fair, good employment, that their livelihoods and their way of living isn't impacted by climate emergency measures. In fact, the Bord na Móna workers I met when they were being laid off a year, 2 years ago, were very, very disillusioned with the whole idea of climate measures, climate emergency measures, as represented by what was being done to them. And one can understand it, because many of them who were told, you'll get jobs, there'll be jobs for you, there'll be alternatives, are ending up in low-paid, minimum wage jobs with no pensions, no trade unions, no real security, and no decent future. And I'd just like to emphasise that the just transition that we need is about absolutely making stark choices about the type of society we live in, put by Naomi Klein very well in her writings on what is required for a Green New Deal, as she calls it, which is a society that is a caring and sharing economy, not one that favours big business, industry, and the drive for future expansion, represented best in this country by the astonishing expansion of data centres, 25% expansion in the last year. The amount of energy they're using up, the energy regulator is warning us about it. We had 3 near misses with the grid in recent times. They absorb a huge amount of energy, and by 2029 will be absorbing 70% of all renewable energy and 30% of the entire energy on the grid. How can that be a just transition when at the same time we're telling farmers they have to cut back on their herd, or we're saying to ordinary people their carbon taxes will increase year on year, and there are many of them who literally cannot afford to retrofit their homes. And if we continue to do this, we are going to create more climate sceptics. The weaknesses in this bill absolutely feed into climate scepticism, and we don't seek to change it to be opposed to the idea of the needs for climate emergency measures, but absolutely to strengthen them. And yet I know that the Minister is going to reject our amendments. There's what's happening in this country is there's weak provisions for just transition for communities, for workers, for individuals, and we need to entirely change the way our economy works and stop facilitating the expansion of big industries at the expense of ordinary people, of small family farms, of workers in this country. And that is what climate justice is about. That's what just transition is about. And we've tried to set out to define it in our amendment, and the definition is worth looking at, because I think the Minister's failure to include just transition as centre to this bill is going to, in the long run, lead, as I say, to a huge amount of climate sceptics throughout the country, and people will hurt. People will hurt as a result of this, and instead of having a countryside littered with databases and windmills to power them, we need a countryside that is ecologically safe, that's friendly, and that has more schools, more properly planned towns, more decent farms that can produce alternative types of food production, and we need to make sure that everybody is included and nobody is left behind. And as was said by other deputies, recommendations from the committee, who worked very, very hard at trying to change the bill, have not been taken on board. The Minister will probably remark that he has taken on board many of our recommendations from the time he issued the first bill, but he couldn't not, because the first bill was so appallingly weak that it would have been impossible not to change it. So we want to see the attempts at just transition being there for a host of items that will support and encourage communities, individuals, workers and society to move on to proper climate change measures. The government, I think, have a flippant and dismissive attitude to this. I just came off drive time on debate with the chair of the committee, Brian Ledden, on data centres, and the interviewer actually said to him, "You don't sound like a deputy from the Green Party, you sound like a deputy from one of the Conservative parties," because he was favouring the expansion of data centres over the need to really focus what renewable energies we produce on powering hospitals, schools, industry, and indeed transport with renewables, rather than the expansion of this sort of immeasurable rise in this business. Renewable energy, whether it's offshore or onshore, is very important, but it needs to be used for important things for our society, a caring and sharing society that looks to develop work and develop how people live in a fair way and doesn't diminish their way of life, but actually enhances it and improves it. And that is how we will improve the environment and the world that we live in, and that's how we get buy-in, and not an increasing amount of climate sceptics. Because, Minister, I'm afraid to say, I think your bill is failing on this most central issue, the question of just transition. All other things really pale into insignificance beside it. I think this debate will trundle on, but there's nothing here for workers, there's nothing here for communities, and the bill's weakness in actually defining what just transition means leaves a lot to be desired. Thank you.
Deputy Richard